Welcome to the Sleepy Bat. Tonight we're stepping into the heart of the greatest empire the world has ever known, Rome at its absolute peak. A realm of marble cities, roaring arenas, and roads that stretched beyond the edge of the known world. But beneath all that glory, something was already breaking. Not in battle, not in fire, but through silent cracks that spread like whispers, until the Roman Empire crumbled to dust. So grab your pillow, close your eyes, and drift back to the golden age of Rome. Picture yourself in Rome, 117 AD. The sun glows on marble columns, and the city, under Emperor Trajan, is the beating heart of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. From northern Britain to the deserts of Africa, from Portugal to Mesopotamia, Rome rules a realm of staggering size, over 2 million square miles, bound by 250,000 miles of roads and nearly 30 legions of elite soldiers. But this empire wasn't just about territory. It was a global civilization. A farmer in Britain could send his son to a legion, trade in Roman markets, and travel safely across provinces using Roman law, Roman coins, and Roman inns. This was the Pax Romana, a golden age of peace and prosperity that lasted over 2 centuries. Engineering marvels, religious tolerance, and cultural fusion created a sense of unity among former enemies. Diversity became Rome's strength, yet even at its height, faint cracks had begun to form, barely visible but growing. The Roman legions, those magnificent war machines that had conquered the world, required constant funding, equipment, and recruitment. Each legion needed not just soldiers, but also engineers, craftsmen, camp followers, and supply trains. And with every new frontier defended and every province pacified, the costs mounted, placing an unbearable strain on the empire's lifeblood, its treasury. The economic burden was staggering. Picture the imperial treasury as a vast pool of gold and silver, constantly being drained by military expenses, public works, the imperial bureaucracy, and the grain dole that kept the population of Rome itself fed and content. To keep this pool filled, the empire needed a constant flow of taxes from its provinces, tribute from client kingdoms, and wealth from trade and conquest. But as the empire reached its natural geographic limits, the flow of new wealth from conquest began to slow, while the expenses of maintaining what had already been won continued to grow. But the costs didn't just pile up behind the palace gates. Soon the weight of Rome's greatness began pressing in from every border. The provinces once secured by Roman strength had become glittering targets. To the tribes beyond the empire, the Germanic warriors, the Pictish clans, the Sarmatian horsemen, Rome was no longer just a name. It was a treasure chest overflowing with grain, gold, and soft cities ripe for raiding. From the dense forests of Germania to the cold hills of Britain, and across the vast Danube frontier, wave after wave of outsiders tested Rome's resolve. Some came seeking peace, others came for blood. But all saw Rome's riches, and while these distant tribes posed constant threats, it was in the east that Rome met its greatest rival, the Persian Empire. Unlike the tribes, Persia was a polished mirror, powerful, ancient, and just as ambitious. Holding the eastern frontier demanded not only gold, but thousands of soldiers stationed far from home, year after year. Emperors like Trajan, Hadrian, and Marcus Aurelius saw the danger coming. They didn't rule from marble thrones. They led from the front lines, walking the muddy roads of the provinces, inspecting forts, and trying desperately to hold the empire together. But as they fought to preserve the empire from without, new cracks were forming within. Rome's economy still rested on fragile foundations: agriculture and slavery. As expansion slowed, so did the flow of new land and labor, and with it the system began to strain. Cities grew, soldiers dwindled. The Roman army, once filled with citizen farmers, now relied on recruits from the very frontiers it once feared. Bit by bit, the empire was becoming less Roman. This transformation was subtle but profound. The Roman army was becoming less Roman with each passing generation, while Roman citizens were becoming less willing to serve in that army. It was a gradual shift that would have enormous consequences in the centuries to come. But for now, in the golden afternoon of the empire's greatest glory, these were merely shadows on the horizon, barely visible against the brilliant sunlight of Roman achievement. As we drift deeper into this ancient world, feeling the warmth of that Mediterranean sun and hearing the distant sounds of the eternal city, let us pause here in this moment of perfect balance, when Rome stood astride the world like a colossus, magnificent and seemingly eternal. Tomorrow we'll continue our gentle journey through time, exploring how these small cracks gradually widened, how the weight of empire slowly became too much to bear, and how the greatest civilization the world had ever known began its long, tragic, but somehow beautiful transformation into something else entirely. For now, let the peace of this ancient evening settle over you, and dream perhaps of marble columns catching the last light of day, of Roman roads stretching toward distant horizons, and of an empire that once seemed as permanent as the stars themselves. The gentle morning light of the 2nd century AD filtered through the windows of imperial palaces across the Roman world, illuminating what would become one of history's most poignant ironies. For it was precisely during these golden years, when Rome appeared most invincible, that the empire began to face a challenge no legion could defeat, no wall could keep out, and no treaty could resolve. This was the challenge of success itself, and the gradual realization that even the mightiest oak tree can be toppled not by a sudden storm, but by the slow, patient work of countless small roots growing beneath its foundation. Picture yourself now as a wealthy Roman senator in the year 160 AD, awakening in your villa overlooking the Bay of Naples. The morning air carries the scent of olive groves and the distant sound of fishermen calling to one another as they haul in their nets. Your slaves bring you reports from your estates scattered across the empire. Your vineyards in Gaul are producing exceptional wine. Your wheat farms in Egypt have yielded a bumper harvest, and your silver mines in Spain continue to pour wealth into your coffers. From your perspective, seated comfortably at the center of the world's greatest empire, everything appears perfectly ordered and eternally stable. Roman law governs from Britain to Babylon. Roman coins are accepted from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean, and Roman culture has become so pervasive that local aristocrats in distant Gaul dress like Romans, speak Latin, and send their sons to study in Rome itself. Yet if you could somehow peer beneath the surface of this magnificent facade, you would begin to notice something troubling. The empire that seemed so solid, so permanent, was actually balanced on an increasingly precarious foundation, like a magnificent palace built on shifting sand. The first crack in this foundation was demographic, though it would take generations for its full impact to be felt. The Italian peninsula, the heartland that had provided Rome with its citizen soldiers and civic leaders for centuries, was slowly emptying. The same prosperity that made Roman civilization so attractive was drawing people away from the countryside and into the cities, where opportunities for trade, craftsmanship, and entertainment offered easier paths to wealth than the back-breaking labor of farming. This might have been merely an interesting social trend except for one crucial fact. The Roman military system depended absolutely on a steady supply of Roman citizens willing to serve in the legions. The Roman army wasn't just a fighting force. It was the primary mechanism by which Roman culture, law, and values spread throughout the empire. Roman soldiers didn't just conquer territory. They built roads, established towns, married local women, and raised children who grew up thinking of themselves as Romans. But as fewer Italians were willing to spend 25 years of their lives in military service, the empire was forced to recruit more and more of its soldiers from the very provinces it was supposed to be controlling. By the late 2nd century, a typical Roman legion might contain more Germans, Gauls, and Britons than actual Romans. These men fought bravely and served faithfully, but they brought with them their own languages, customs, and loyalties that gradually began to transform the character of the Roman military from within. The economic implications of this demographic shift were equally profound. Roman taxation was a complex system that depended on the productivity of millions of small farmers throughout the empire. These farmers grew the grain that fed the cities, produced the olive oil and wine that were traded across the Mediterranean, and generated the surplus wealth that funded the imperial government. But as more and more people abandoned rural life for urban opportunities, the tax base began to erode even as the expenses of government continued to grow. The Roman response to this challenge reveals both the brilliance and the fatal flaw of imperial administration. Rather than address the underlying demographic and economic problems, successive emperors chose to expand the definition of Roman citizenship, gradually extending full legal rights to more and more of the empire's inhabitants. This was, in many ways, a remarkably enlightened policy that created unprecedented social mobility and cultural integration. Consider the career of a man like Lucius Septimius Severus, who became emperor in 193 AD, born in what is now Libya to a family of mixed Roman and local ancestry. Severus rose through the imperial bureaucracy to command legions, govern provinces, and ultimately rule the entire empire. His story illustrates how Roman citizenship had become a kind of universal passport to advancement, allowing talented individuals from any corner of the empire to reach the highest levels of power. Yet this same inclusiveness, admirable as it was, created new tensions within the imperial system. As citizenship became more common, it became less valuable. The special privileges that had once motivated conquered peoples to strive for Roman status gradually lost their meaning. More importantly, the expansion of citizenship meant that more and more of the empire's inhabitants had the right to move freely throughout Roman territory. To claim support from imperial welfare systems and to participate in the political processes that determined imperial policy. The result was a gradual but fundamental transformation in the nature of the empire itself. Rome had begun as a city-state that conquered and controlled other peoples. By the 3rd century, it was becoming something entirely different. A multinational, multicultural federation held together more by shared institutions and common interests than by the dominance of any single ethnic group or geographic region. This transformation might have been sustainable if the empire had enjoyed unlimited resources and faced no external threats. But Rome's very success had created a paradox that would prove impossible to resolve. The more territory the empire controlled, the more expensive it became to defend. The more prosperous the provinces became, the more attractive they appeared to outside raiders. The more Roman culture spread, the more it was diluted and transformed by local influences. The mathematical reality was stark and unforgiving. By the late 2nd century, the Roman Empire was spending approximately 60% of its total budget on military expenses. This included not just the wages and equipment for the legions, but also the massive infrastructure required to support them. Fortifications along thousands of miles of frontier, supply depots stocked with everything from armor to medical supplies, naval bases to protect crucial sea routes, and the administrative apparatus needed to coordinate military operations across 3 continents. To fund this enormous military establishment, the empire required a level of taxation that pushed many provinces to the very limits of their economic capacity. Roman tax collectors, once welcomed as symbols of imperial order and protection, increasingly came to be seen as oppressive burdens on local communities. The very prosperity that Rome had brought to its provinces was being consumed by the cost of maintaining the military forces needed to protect that prosperity. This economic pressure created a vicious cycle that would haunt the empire for centuries to come. Higher taxes reduced the prosperity of the provinces, which in turn reduced their ability to pay taxes, which forced the imperial government to raise taxes even higher. Meanwhile, the barbarian tribes pressing against Rome's frontiers could see clearly that the empire's defenses were becoming increasingly strained and expensive to maintain. The Germanic tribes of Central Europe were particularly well positioned to exploit Rome's difficulties. Unlike earlier barbarian adversaries, these peoples had been in contact with Roman civilization for generations. They understood Roman military tactics, had adopted Roman weapons and equipment, and in many cases had served in Roman armies as auxiliary troops or mercenaries. They knew the empire's strengths, but they also knew its weaknesses. More importantly, these tribes were themselves under pressure from other peoples migrating westward from the steppes of Central Asia. The complex chain of population movements that historians called the migration period was already beginning, creating a domino effect that would eventually push millions of people against Rome's northern and eastern frontiers. The Goths were being pressed by the Huns. The Vandals were being displaced by the Goths, and the various Germanic confederations were being forced to choose between fighting each other for increasingly scarce resources or turning their attention toward the wealthy Roman provinces to the south. The Persian Empire, meanwhile, was experiencing its own renaissance under the Sassanid dynasty. The old Parthian kingdom that had fought Rome to a standstill for centuries had been replaced by a more centralized, more aggressive power that combined Persian imperial traditions with innovative military techniques borrowed from both Rome and the nomadic peoples of Central Asia. The new Persian Empire wasn't content to simply defend its traditional territories. It actively sought to reclaim lands that Persia had controlled in ancient times, including much of what is now Turkey, Syria, and Iraq. For Rome, this meant maintaining substantial military forces along two completely different types of frontiers. In the north and west, the empire faced mobile barbarian tribes who preferred to raid and retreat rather than hold territory. These enemies required a different kind of defense: fortified boundaries, rapid response forces, and the ability to pursue raiders back into their own territories. In the east, Rome faced a sophisticated empire with professional armies, siege equipment, and territorial ambitions that required conventional military responses. The strain of defending on multiple fronts against different types of enemies was enormous, but it was made worse by the empire's internal political structure. The Roman Empire had never developed a clear, consistent system for choosing emperors or transferring power from one ruler to the next. During the golden age of the 2nd century, this hadn't mattered much because the empire was ruled by a series of exceptionally capable men who chose their own successors based on merit rather than heredity. But this system depended absolutely on the wisdom and longevity of individual emperors. When Marcus Aurelius, the last of the great 2nd century emperors, died in 180 AD and was succeeded by his unstable son Commodus, the empire entered a period of political chaos that would last, with brief interruptions, for nearly a century. The crisis wasn't just about bad emperors, though there were certainly plenty of those. The fundamental problem was that the empire had become too large and complex to be effectively governed by any single individual, no matter how capable. The emperor was expected to be simultaneously a military commander, a chief administrator, a religious leader, a judge of final appeal, and a symbol of imperial unity. He was supposed to personally lead armies on distant frontiers, while also managing the complex bureaucracy that governed hundreds of different cities and peoples. This impossible job became even more difficult as the empire's problems multiplied. An emperor might spend years campaigning against Germanic tribes along the Rhine, only to learn that Persian armies had invaded Syria. He might succeed in restoring order in one province, only to discover that his absence had encouraged rebellion in another. The very size that had once been Rome's greatest strength was becoming its greatest weakness. As we settle deeper into the gentle rhythms of this ancient evening, listening to the distant sound of night birds calling across the Roman countryside, we begin to understand that what we're witnessing isn't really the story of an empire's failure, but rather the story of success becoming too heavy to carry. Rome hadn't grown weak. It had grown too strong, too large, too complex for any single system of government to manage indefinitely. The empire that had once seemed as eternal as the stars was beginning to discover the melancholy truth that all things, no matter how magnificent, carry within themselves the seeds of their own transformation. But that transformation, when it came, would be far stranger and more beautiful than anyone in that golden second century could possibly have imagined. The third century dawned with an ominous stillness, like the moment before a great storm when even the birds stop singing and the air itself seems to hold its breath. If you had been standing in the Forum of Rome on a crisp morning in the year 235 AD, you might have noticed that something indefinable had changed in the empire's heartbeat. The marble still gleamed, the fountains still sang their eternal songs, and merchants still called out their wares in a dozen different languages. Yet beneath this familiar symphony of imperial life, a new rhythm was beginning to emerge, irregular, unpredictable, and deeply troubling. Picture yourself as a provincial governor in Gaul during these uncertain times, receiving dispatches from Rome that arrive with increasing irregularity and carry ever more disturbing news. The emperor who appointed you has been murdered by his own guards. His successor lasted barely 6 months before meeting the same fate. The man who claimed power after that has been defeated in battle by yet another pretender, who now marches on Rome with promises to restore order and stability. This wasn't merely political turbulence. It was the visible symptom of something far more profound happening within the empire's very soul. Between 235 and 284 AD, a period historians call the crisis of the third century, Rome would be ruled by approximately 50 different emperors. Most would die violent deaths. Many would never be recognized by significant portions of the empire. Some would control only a few provinces or even just a single city, before being swept away by the tide of chaos that seemed to engulf everything. But here's what makes this crisis so particularly tragic and fascinating. It wasn't caused by any single catastrophic event or overwhelming enemy. Instead, it was the result of all those small pressures we've been watching build up over the previous century, finally reaching a critical mass, like individual snowflakes that eventually trigger an avalanche. The demographic changes that had been quietly reshaping Roman society for generations suddenly accelerated into something resembling a complete transformation. The old Italian aristocracy that had guided the empire through its golden age was disappearing. Not through any dramatic purge or persecution, but simply through the gradual attrition of families that chose wealth and comfort over public service. Their places were being taken by ambitious newcomers from the provinces, men with names like Maximinus Thrax, Philip the Arab, and Aurelian, who brought with them different values, different priorities, and different ideas about what the empire should be. These new leaders were often remarkably capable soldiers and administrators, but they lacked the deep cultural connections that had once bound the imperial system together. A senator from an old Roman family might disagree with an emperor's policies, but he would never question the fundamental legitimacy of imperial rule itself. A general who had risen from the ranks of auxiliary troops recruited from the Germanic frontier had no such sentimental attachment to Roman traditions. If an emperor proved incompetent or unpopular, why not simply replace him with someone more effective? This pragmatic approach to leadership might have worked in a smaller, simpler state, but it was catastrophic for an empire that depended on the mystique of imperial authority to maintain order across vast distances. When word spread that emperors could be made and unmade by ambitious generals, every provincial commander with sufficient troops began to see himself as a potential ruler. The result was a cascade of civil wars that consumed the empire's resources and attention just when external threats were reaching unprecedented levels. The barbarian pressure along Rome's northern frontiers had been building like water behind a dam for decades, and now the dam was beginning to crack. The Gothic Confederation, a loose alliance of tribes that had been coalescing beyond the Danube, launched their first major invasion of Roman territory in 238 AD. Unlike earlier barbarian raids that sought only plunder and slaves, this was something entirely different, a mass migration of entire peoples seeking new homes within the empire's borders. The Goths weren't necessarily hostile to Roman civilization. Many of their leaders had served as officers in Roman armies, spoke Latin fluently, and genuinely admired Roman culture and institutions. But they were under enormous pressure from other peoples moving westward from the Asian steppes, and they needed somewhere to settle their families, graze their cattle, and establish permanent communities. From their perspective, the sparsely populated provinces along the Danube offered ideal opportunities for peaceful settlement, if only the Romans would be reasonable about sharing their vast territories. From Rome's perspective, however, these migrations represented an existential threat to the entire imperial system. The empire's finances depended on controlling and taxing specific territories. Its military strategy was based on maintaining clear boundaries between Roman and non-Roman lands. Its social structure assumed that citizenship was something granted by imperial authorities to deserving individuals, not something that could be claimed by entire tribes simply by crossing a river. The result was a series of conflicts that neither side really wanted but that proved almost impossible to avoid. Gothic settlers would cross the Danube seeking farmland. Roman authorities would order them to leave. Fighting would break out, and before long entire provinces would be devastated by warfare that benefited no one and impoverished everyone involved. Meanwhile, the Persian Empire under the Sassanid dynasty was experiencing its own period of aggressive expansion. King Shapur the Fumur, who ruled from 240 to 270 AD, was perhaps the most formidable enemy Rome had faced in centuries. Unlike the barbarian tribes, Persia possessed all the advantages of an advanced civilization: professional armies, sophisticated siege equipment, an efficient administrative system, and enormous financial resources derived from controlling the lucrative trade routes between Asia and the Mediterranean world. Shapur's armies didn't just raid Roman territory, they conquered it systematically, capturing major cities like Antioch and establishing permanent Persian control over regions that had been Roman for centuries. In 260 AD, Persian forces achieved something that would have been unthinkable during Rome's Golden Age. They captured a Roman emperor, Valerian, in battle and held him prisoner until his death. The psychological impact of this humiliation was enormous. For centuries, Roman emperors had been regarded as semi-divine figures whose authority derived from their connection to the gods themselves. The idea that a Roman emperor could be defeated, captured, and held prisoner by a foreign king shattered fundamental assumptions about imperial invincibility that had helped hold the empire together for generations. Yet even as Rome struggled with these external challenges, internal problems were multiplying at an alarming rate. The empire's monetary system, which had remained stable for centuries, began to collapse under the pressure of constantly increasing military expenses. Emperors desperate for funds to pay their armies resorted to debasing the currency, reducing the silver content of coins and printing money to cover immediate needs without regard for long-term consequences. The result was inflation on a scale that the ancient world had never experienced. Prices for basic commodities like wheat and olive oil increased by factors of 10 or 20 within a few decades. Trade networks that had functioned smoothly for centuries broke down as merchants lost confidence in Roman currency. Cities that had prospered from commerce found themselves struggling to maintain basic services as their tax revenues became worthless. The social consequences were devastating. The middle classes that had formed the backbone of Roman society, small farmers, urban craftsmen, local merchants, found themselves trapped between rising prices and fixed incomes. Many were forced to abandon their traditional occupations and seek protection from wealthy landowners who could offer security in exchange for labor. This process, which historians call the rise of the colonate system, effectively marked the beginning of the end for the free peasantry that had once made Rome great. Even more troubling was the empire's growing reliance on barbarian troops to defend its frontiers. What had begun as a practical expedient, recruiting Germanic warriors as auxiliary troops to supplement Roman legions, gradually became an absolute necessity as fewer and fewer Roman citizens were willing or able to serve in the military. By the middle of the 3rd century, entire Roman armies consisted primarily of Gothic, Vandal, or Frankish warriors commanded by officers who might never have set foot in Rome itself. These barbarian soldiers fought bravely and served faithfully, but their loyalty was personal rather than institutional. They served specific commanders who paid them regularly and led them to victory, not abstract concepts like the Roman state or the imperial system. When their commanders died or were replaced, their allegiance could shift accordingly. When their pay was late or their treatment was poor, they might simply march away to find more generous employers. This transformation of the Roman military from a citizen army into a barbarian mercenary force had profound implications that extended far beyond simple military effectiveness. The Roman legions had traditionally served as schools of citizenship, teaching provincial recruits Roman law, Roman values, and Roman ways of thinking. Barbarian federati, allied troops fighting under their own commanders, brought their own customs, languages, and loyalties with them, gradually transforming the empire from within. The cities that had once been the glory of Roman civilization began to change as well. Urban life, which had flourished during the peaceful centuries of the Pax Romana, became increasingly dangerous and uncertain. Trade declined, public buildings fell into disrepair, and wealthy citizens retreated to fortified villas in the countryside where they could better protect themselves and their families. Rome itself, the eternal city that had once boasted a population of over 1 million inhabitants, began to shrink as residents fled to safer and more prosperous regions. The great public works projects that had employed thousands of workers ground to a halt, The elaborate system of aqueducts that had supplied the city with fresh water from distant mountains required constant maintenance that cash-strapped imperial governments could no longer afford. Yet perhaps the most profound change was taking place in the realm of ideas and beliefs. The old Roman religion, with its emphasis on civic duty and public service, was gradually giving way to new forms of spirituality that emphasized personal salvation and eternal life. Mystery cults from the East, worship of Mithras, Isis, and eventually Christianity offered hope and meaning to people whose traditional sources of identity and security were crumbling around them. Christianity in particular was spreading with remarkable speed throughout the empire, especially among the urban poor and the growing population of slaves and freedmen. The Christian message of spiritual equality and divine love provided comfort to people who found little to hope for in the increasingly chaotic world of imperial politics. More importantly, Christian communities offered practical support: food for the hungry, care for the sick, protection for widows and orphans, that overstretched imperial institutions could no longer provide. The growth of Christianity represented more than just a change in religious preference. It signaled a fundamental shift in how people understood their place in the world. Traditional Roman religion had been deeply connected to the state, with emperors serving as high priests and religious ceremonies marking important civic occasions. Christianity, by contrast, taught that ultimate loyalty belonged to God rather than Caesar, that spiritual citizenship in the kingdom of heaven was more important than legal citizenship in the Roman Empire. This wasn't necessarily a hostile or subversive message. Most Christians were loyal subjects who paid their taxes and obeyed imperial laws, but it did represent a gradual withdrawal of emotional and intellectual investment from the imperial system itself. People who believed that their true home was in heaven were less likely to make the sacrifices necessary to preserve earthly empires, no matter how magnificent those empires might be. As we pause here in this moment of transformation, watching the empire that had once seemed as permanent as the mountains themselves begin to reshape into something entirely different, we can almost feel the weight of history pressing down like a gentle hand on a sleeping child's forehead. The Rome that had conquered the world was becoming something new, something that its founders could never have imagined, not through any dramatic collapse or catastrophic defeat, but through the slow, patient work of countless individual choices made by millions of ordinary people seeking safety, meaning, and hope in an increasingly uncertain world. The Golden Age was ending, but what was beginning to emerge from its ruins would prove to be just as remarkable, just as complex, and just as deeply human as anything that had come before. The gentle twilight of the 4th century settled over a Roman world that bore little resemblance to the empire we left behind in those golden days of Trajan and Marcus Aurelius. Picture yourself now as a traveler making your way along one of those famous Roman roads in the year 350 AD, perhaps journeying from Gaul toward the ancient capital itself. The road beneath your feet is still solid, still expertly engineered with those massive stone blocks that Roman builders had laid down centuries before. But look more closely and you'll notice something troubling. Weeds push up between the stones in places where maintenance crews no longer pass. Some of the mile markers bear names of emperors you've never heard of. Rulers who claimed power for mere months before vanishing into the chaos of civil war. The countryside through which you travel tells a story of profound transformation. Where once you might have seen prosperous farms worked by free peasants who took pride in their Roman citizenship, now you observe vast estates worked by laborers who are bound to the land, neither slave nor free, but something in between. These are the colony agricultural workers who have traded their freedom for security, accepting a kind of feudal bondage in exchange for protection from the bandits, tax collectors, and military recruiters who plague the highways. The villages you pass have changed as well. Many are now surrounded by rough stone walls, hastily built fortifications that speak of a world where safety can no longer be taken for granted. The old Roman civic buildings, the forums where citizens once gathered to debate politics, the basilicas where merchants conducted their business, the public baths where social life flourished, stand empty or have been converted to other purposes. Christian churches, simple but earnest structures built from the stones of abandoned temples, rise in their place. This transformation wasn't the result of conquest by foreign armies or the collapse of imperial institutions in any dramatic sense. Rather, it was something far more subtle and in its way more profound. The Roman Empire was evolving into something entirely different through a process that historians would later call transformation rather than fall. The old systems weren't being destroyed so much as they were being gradually replaced by new forms of organization better suited to the changed circumstances of the age. The most visible symbol of this transformation was the rise of Christianity from a persecuted minority to the empire's dominant religion. When Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity in the early 4th century and issued the Edict of Milan granting religious tolerance throughout the empire, he wasn't simply changing his personal beliefs. He was acknowledging a reality that had been building for generations. The old Roman civic religion had lost its power to inspire loyalty and sacrifice among the empire's increasingly diverse population. Christianity offered something that traditional Roman paganism could not: a universal message that transcended ethnic and social boundaries, a promise of personal salvation that gave meaning to suffering, and most importantly, an organizational structure that could function independently of imperial government. Christian bishops elected by their communities and answerable ultimately to God rather than Caesar provided leadership and social services that overstretched imperial bureaucracies could no longer deliver effectively. The spread of Christianity also reflected a broader shift in how people understood their relationship to political authority. The old Roman ideal of civic virtue, the notion that citizens should willingly sacrifice their personal interests for the good of the state, was giving way to a more individualistic spirituality that emphasized personal righteousness and divine judgment. This wasn't necessarily a rejection of worldly authority, but it did represent a fundamental change in priorities that made the empire's traditional demands for military service and civic participation increasingly difficult to enforce. Meanwhile, the economic foundations of imperial power continued to erode in ways that were almost imperceptible from year to year but devastating when viewed across decades. The great trade networks that had once carried goods from Britain to Babylon were fragmenting into smaller, more localized systems as the costs and risks of long-distance commerce became prohibitive. Cities that had grown wealthy as intermediaries in this global trade found themselves cut off from their traditional sources of prosperity. The imperial currency, once accepted from Scotland to Sudan, had become so debased and unreliable that many regions reverted to barter systems or created their own local monetary standards. A farmer in Gaul might accept payment in grain rather than coins, while a merchant in Egypt might prefer to trade in gold by weight rather than trust the silver content of official imperial currency. This fragmentation of economic life made it increasingly difficult for the central government to collect the taxes it needed to maintain its armies and bureaucracy. Perhaps most significantly, the barbarian peoples who had once pressed against Rome's frontiers as hostile outsiders were now increasingly integrated into the empire's military and administrative structures. Germanic chieftains served as Roman generals, their sons studied Latin literature in Roman schools, and their daughters married into Roman aristocratic families. The Visigothic king Athanaric could trace his ancestry back to ancient Germanic tribal traditions, but he was also a Roman citizen who had served with distinction in the imperial army and who governed his people according to a mixture of Gothic custom and Roman law. This process of integration was both Rome's greatest strength and its ultimate transformation. By incorporating barbarian peoples into the imperial system rather than simply trying to exclude or destroy them, Rome had found a way to manage the great migrations that might otherwise have overwhelmed its defenses entirely. But the price of this success was the gradual barbarization of Roman institutions themselves. The Roman Senate, that ancient body that had once guided the Republic's expansion across the Mediterranean, now included men whose fathers had worn wolf pelts and worshipped Woden in the forests of Germania. The Roman army, once the disciplined force that had conquered 3 continents, was now largely composed of federates, allied barbarian troops fighting under their own commanders according to their own customs. Even the imperial court had taken on an increasingly Germanic character, with emperors adopting barbarian dress, barbarian bodyguards, and barbarian military tactics. This transformation was perhaps most visible in the empire's new capitals. Rome itself, the eternal city that had given its name to the entire civilization, was no longer the effective center of imperial power. Constantine had established a new capital at Constantinople, strategically located at the crossroads between Europe and Asia, while other emperors ruled from Milan, Ravenna, Trier, or wherever military necessity required their presence. The old Rome, meanwhile, was becoming something like a museum of its former greatness. The ancient monuments still stood, the Colosseum, the Pantheon, the Forum Romanum, but they were increasingly surrounded by Christian churches and barbarian settlements. The population had shrunk from its imperial peak of over 1 million inhabitants to perhaps 1/10 of that number. Wolves were said to roam the ruins of neighborhoods that had once housed senators and merchants from across the known world. Yet this apparent decline masked a different kind of vitality. The bishops of Rome were emerging as spiritual leaders whose authority transcended the political boundaries of the fragmenting empire. Christian monasteries were preserving and copying the literary treasures of classical antiquity, even as the secular schools that had produced them closed their doors. Germanic kings were adopting Roman titles and Roman administrative practices even as they carved out independent kingdoms from former imperial territories. The process was perhaps most clearly visible along the empire's northern frontiers, where the distinction between Roman and barbarian had become increasingly meaningless. A Gothic chieftain might govern a Roman province according to Roman law, while maintaining his ancestral customs in private life. His soldiers might wear Roman armor and carry Roman standards while singing Germanic war songs as they marched. His subjects might speak Latin in the marketplace while preserving their ancestral languages at home. This cultural fusion created new forms of identity that were neither purely Roman nor purely barbarian, but something entirely novel. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, the Frankish kingdoms in Gaul. These weren't simply barbarian conquests of Roman territory, but hybrid civilizations that combined Germanic vigor with Roman sophistication, creating something that would eventually evolve into medieval European civilization. The economic implications of this transformation were equally profound. The vast imperial economy that had once moved goods across 3 continents was fragmenting into smaller, more sustainable regional systems. Instead of Egyptian grain feeding the population of Rome, local agriculture was developing to meet local needs. Instead of British silver funding legions in Mesopotamia, regional resources were being used to support regional defense forces. This localization of economic life represented a significant decline in the overall complexity and sophistication of European civilization. But it also created more resilient and adaptable forms of social organization. A Gallic villa that produced its own food, manufactured its own tools, and defended itself with its own armed retainers might be less cosmopolitan than the great urban centers of the imperial age. But it was also less vulnerable to the disruptions that came with political chaos and military conflict. The transformation was spiritual as well as political and economic. The old Roman civic virtues, duty to the state, honor and military service, pride in public accomplishment, were giving way to Christian values that emphasized humility, charity, and preparation for eternal life. This wasn't simply a matter of changing religious preferences. It represented a fundamental shift in how people understood the purpose of human existence itself. A Roman senator of the 2nd century would have measured his success by his service to the state, his accumulation of public honors, and his contribution to the glory of the empire. A Christian bishop of the 5th century measured his success by his service to God, his care for the poor and suffering, and his preparation of souls for salvation. Both were admirable ideals, but they pointed toward very different kinds of civilization. As we drift through this transformed landscape, watching the last golden light of the classical world fade into the gentle darkness of what would become the medieval age, we begin to understand that what we're witnessing isn't really the death of Roman civilization so much as its metamorphosis into something entirely new. The empire that had once seemed as permanent as the mountains was revealing the profound truth that all human institutions, no matter how magnificent, must eventually change or perish. But in that change, in that gradual transformation from one form of greatness to another, we can glimpse something beautiful and hopeful about the human spirit itself. For even as the old world crumbled, new forms of community, new sources of meaning, and new expressions of human creativity were emerging from its ruins, preparing the way for centuries of development that would eventually produce the cathedrals of Chartres, the universities of Paris, and the poetry of Dante. The Roman Empire was losing everything it had once been, but in that loss it was also becoming everything it was destined to become. The dawn of the 5th century found the Roman world caught in a curious paradox that would have bewildered the great emperors of old. Picture yourself standing in the marble halls of Ravenna, the new imperial capital where Emperor Honorius held court, surrounded by the trappings of ancient majesty yet dependent entirely on barbarian generals to maintain even the pretense of power. The purple robe still gleamed with imperial authority, the eagles still adorned the standards, and the ancient ceremonies still proclaimed the eternal nature of Roman rule. Yet everyone present, from the emperor himself to the humblest scribe, understood that they were witnessing the final act of a drama that had been unfolding for centuries. What makes this moment so profoundly tragic and yet so beautifully human is that the end didn't come through any single catastrophic event that historians could point to and say, "Here, this is where Rome fell." Instead, it came through a process so gradual, so organic, that contemporaries barely noticed it happening. It was like watching a magnificent sunset that takes hours to fade from brilliant gold to deep purple to the gentle darkness of night, each stage so subtle that only by looking back could one appreciate the totality of the transformation. The man who perhaps best embodied this paradox was Flavius Stilicho, a half-Vandal general who served as the power behind the throne during the early years of the 5th century. Here was a figure who would have been unthinkable during Rome's Golden Age. A barbarian commanding Roman legions, making policy for Roman emperors, and defending Roman territories against other barbarians who were in many cases his own distant relatives. Yet Stilicho was, by all accounts, a loyal Roman who genuinely believed in the empire's mission and fought tirelessly to preserve its integrity. Stilicho's career illustrates how completely the nature of Roman power had transformed. When he led his armies against Gothic invaders, half his soldiers were Goths themselves, fighting under Roman banners for Roman pay but maintaining their ancestral customs and loyalties. When he negotiated with barbarian chieftains, he often spoke to them in their own languages and understood their cultural values in ways that traditional Roman aristocrats never could. He was simultaneously Rome's greatest defender and the symbol of how thoroughly Roman civilization had been transformed by the very peoples it was supposed to be defending against. The economic realities underlying this transformation were stark and unforgiving. The empire that had once commanded the wealth of 3 continents was now struggling to pay the salaries of its own defenders. imperial mints continued to produce coins bearing the emperor's image. But these coins contained so little precious metal that merchants often refused to accept them. The great tax system that had funded centuries of imperial expansion had become a mechanism for impoverishing the very provinces it was supposed to protect. Consider the plight of a typical Roman landowner in Gaul during this period. He might own thousands of acres of fertile farmland, employ hundreds of agricultural workers, and live in a villa decorated with fine mosaics and equipped with heated floors. Yet he lived in constant fear of tax collectors who might demand more than his estates could produce, of barbarian raiders who might burn his crops and steal his livestock, and of imperial officials who might requisition his property for military purposes without compensation. The rational response to such pressures was to seek protection from whoever could provide it most effectively, regardless of whether that protector held Roman titles or barbarian ones. A Gallic aristocrat might find that a Gothic chieftain offered better security for his family and property than the distant imperial government ever could. The chieftain, in turn, might find that adopting Roman administrative practices and legal traditions made governing his new territories easier and more profitable. This process of mutual accommodation created a web of relationships that transcended the traditional boundaries between Roman and barbarian, civilized and savage, citizen and foreigner. A Visigothic king might marry his daughter to a Roman senator, appoint Roman bureaucrats to govern his cities, and issue laws that combined Germanic custom with Roman jurisprudence. His subjects might speak Latin in public while preserving their ancestral tongues at home, worship in Christian churches built on the foundations of pagan temples, and serve in armies that bore Roman names while following barbarian battle tactics. The religious transformation of the empire added another layer of complexity to this cultural fusion. Christianity had become not just the dominant religion but the primary source of institutional continuity. As secular government became increasingly unreliable, Christian bishops often wielded more real authority in their cities than imperial governors, providing not just spiritual guidance but practical services like food distribution, dispute resolution, and defense coordination. The rise of monasticism represented perhaps the most profound challenge to traditional Roman values. Young men and women who might once have served in the legions or the imperial bureaucracy were instead withdrawing from worldly affairs entirely, dedicating their lives to prayer, study, and service to the poor. From a traditional Roman perspective, this represented a catastrophic waste of human resources. From a Christian perspective, it represented the highest form of service to God and humanity. These monastic communities were creating new forms of social organization that operated independently of imperial authority. A monastery might preserve classical learning, provide education to local children, offer hospitality to travelers, and serve as a center of agricultural innovation, all while maintaining complete spiritual independence from secular rulers. In many ways, these religious communities were more successful at maintaining the civilizing mission of Rome than the empire itself. The military situation, meanwhile, had evolved into something that would have been incomprehensible to the legionaries who conquered Gaul and Britain. The Roman army of the 5th century consisted almost entirely of barbarian federates, fighting under their own commanders according to their own customs. These troops were often extraordinarily effective in battle, but their loyalty was personal and conditional rather than institutional and absolute. A Gothic war band might serve faithfully for years under a Roman general who treated them well and paid them regularly. But if that general was replaced by someone they didn't trust, or if their pay was delayed, or if they received a better offer from another commander, they might simply march away to seek employment elsewhere. This wasn't treachery in any meaningful sense. It was simply the logical response to a system that treated military service as a contractual relationship rather than a civic duty. The implications of this transformation extended far beyond military effectiveness. The Roman legions had traditionally served as schools of citizenship, teaching provincial recruits Roman law, Roman values, and Roman ways of thinking. Barbarian federates brought their own cultures with them, gradually transforming the empire from within. A Gothic chieftain's son might learn Latin and study Roman history, but he would also learn Gothic war songs and ancestral genealogies that connected him to a cultural tradition that predated Roman contact by centuries. The cities that had once been the glory of Roman civilization were adapting to these changed circumstances in ways that revealed both decline and resilience. Urban populations were shrinking as trade networks fragmented and economic opportunities moved to the countryside. Public buildings were being abandoned or converted to new purposes. Temples became churches, theaters became workshops, bathhouses became private residences. Yet even as the physical infrastructure of classical urban life deteriorated, new forms of city life were emerging. Christian communities created their own centers of social activity around churches and monasteries. Barbarian settlements within former Roman cities brought new crafts, new foods, and new forms of entertainment. The result was often a more diverse, more culturally rich urban environment, even if it was less grand and sophisticated than what had come before. The transformation was perhaps most visible in the realm of art and literature. The classical tradition that had dominated Roman culture for centuries was giving way to new forms of expression that reflected the empire's changed demographics and priorities. Epic poems celebrating barbarian heroes began to appear alongside traditional Roman historical works. Christian hymns and theological treatises competed with classical philosophy for educated audiences. Germanic metalwork and jewelry influenced Roman decorative arts, while Roman architectural techniques were adapted to barbarian building traditions. This cultural synthesis produced works of remarkable beauty and sophistication that drew on multiple traditions simultaneously. The Virgilius Vaticanus, a magnificent illuminated manuscript of Virgil's Aeneid produced in the late 4th or early 5th century, combined classical Roman poetry with artistic techniques borrowed from throughout the empire. Gothic churches in Italy incorporated Roman architectural elements while serving congregations that included both Latin-speaking Romans and Germanic-speaking immigrants. Language itself was evolving in ways that reflected the empire's transformation. Latin remained the language of government, religion, and high culture, but it was increasingly influenced by the Germanic, Celtic, and other languages spoken by the empire's diverse population. New words entered the Latin vocabulary. Pronunciation shifted to accommodate non-native speakers, and grammatical structures began to change in ways that would eventually produce the Romance languages of medieval Europe. The economic foundations of this transformed world were necessarily different from those of the classical empire. The great trade networks that had once carried goods from Britain to Babylon were fragmenting into smaller, more localized systems. This represented a significant decline in overall economic complexity, but it also created more resilient forms of economic organization that were less vulnerable to political disruption. A typical estate of the late imperial period was designed to be as self-sufficient as possible, producing its own food, manufacturing its own tools, and providing its own defense. This localization of economic life meant that individual communities were less dependent on the complex supply chains that had made classical civilization possible. But it also meant that they were better able to survive the political chaos that marked the empire's final centuries. The social implications of this economic transformation were profound. The old Roman class system, based on citizenship status and public service, was giving way to a more feudal arrangement based on personal relationships and military service. A Gothic chieftain might hold Roman titles and govern according to Roman law, but his real authority derived from his ability to protect his followers and provide them with land, loot, and status within his war band. This shift from civic to personal loyalty represented a fundamental change in how people understood their place in society. A Roman citizen of the 2nd century defined himself primarily in relation to the state, as a member of a particular tribe, a resident of a particular city, a holder of particular legal rights and obligations. A Gallic peasant of the 5th century defined himself primarily in relation to his immediate community, as a follower of a particular lord, a member of a particular village, a participant in a particular network of personal relationships. As we drift through this transformed landscape, watching the last light of the classical world fade into the gentle darkness of what historians would later call the Dark Ages, we begin to understand that what we're witnessing isn't really the destruction of Roman civilization so much as its evolution into something entirely new. The empire that had once ruled the world was discovering that even the mightiest human institutions must eventually adapt or perish. And that adaptation often requires accepting changes so profound that the result bears little resemblance to what came before. The Roman Empire didn't lose everything in any single moment of dramatic collapse. Instead, it gradually transformed into something else, something that preserved many Roman elements while incorporating new influences from across the known world. The languages, laws, religious traditions, and cultural values that emerged from this transformation would shape European civilization for the next 1,000 years, carrying forward the best of Roman achievement while adapting to the needs of a changed world. In this long, gentle twilight of imperial power, we can glimpse something both tragic and beautiful about the human condition itself. All things pass, even the greatest empires, but in their passing they plant seeds that will eventually bloom into new forms of greatness that their creators could never have imagined.